It's worth noting, Benjamin, that we of course share the world's horrors at the invasion of Ukraine and the toll it's taken on the country and on innocent civilians. As an anti-Semitism podcast, I wanted to speak to you specifically about the aspect of the rhetoric and reaction surrounding the war. To begin with, Benjamin, the Russian missile attack on Babin Yar was aimed at the Kiev TV tower, which is right by the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center. Original reports suggested that the memorial had been hit, but subsequent reports suggest that it was not in fact damaged. Either way, that particular strike was reported to have killed 5 people. Clearly, Putin's military appeared indifferent to the risk of striking Babin Yar, despite his stated desire to, and I quote, strive for the demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, a line that was reinforced by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Putin's denazification claim prompted outrage from people around the world, including the Jewish community. First of all, what does Putin actually mean when he says denazification?
So, it's important to understand before we talk about Putin's claims, the legacy the Nazis had on Eastern Europe and the Russian psyche. During World War II, most of the war in the European theatre was fought in Eastern Europe. It was Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, and it came with an enormous cost to life. And that legacy was exploited to the full extent by the Soviet leadership, which ruled these territories during and after the war. So, in the modern context, when talking to an Eastern European audience, how else would Putin justify a nationalist war, if not with reference to Russia's greatest 20th century foe, the one whose battles scar the memories of Eastern Europe? Putin's supporters point as evidence to the Ukrainian Azov Battalion, which is a neo-Nazi militia. And this helps Putin present what they're doing as a fight against that old enemy. The Azov Battalion rose to prominence in 2014 when they helped to defend the city of Mariupol against Russian forces, and this has led to them becoming formally incorporated into Ukraine's National Guard, which does mean that Ukraine has effectively had neo-Nazis on its payroll since then. The Azov Battalion has even provided military-style training courses to Ukrainian civilians, including some who are now fighting Russian forces. In recent years, and this is to emphasize just how worrying and troublesome the Azov Battalion is, it's emerged that far-right pages on Facebook are fundraising and have provided funding for the Azov Battalion, as well as another far-right group in Ukraine. And Facebook has come under pressure for that. Particularly one of Azov Battalion's Facebook pages at the time was reportedly called Gas Chambers, and visitors were directed to websites where imagery of white skinheads standing next to murdered Jewish and black men were featured alongside products for purchase. So the Azov Battalion is clearly a problematic group. They've even gone so far as to try and recruit far-right Britons to join their fight in Ukraine.
Wow, that's truly shocking. So, knowing this, is Putin's denazification claim all that objectionable?
Well, yes, it's totally absurd. As Vice puts it, Azov's formal status with the National Guard has been a gift to Russian propaganda. And it's true. When you look at the Azov Battalion, it does make Putin's claim of denazification sound reasonable. But it's not representative of the Ukrainian armed forces or the country. In fact, notwithstanding the gains that the far right has made in electoral politics in Eastern Europe, Ukraine has been something of an exception. In a 2018 report from the Pew Research Center, 5% of Ukrainians said they would not be willing to accept Jews as citizens of their country. Now, that number is far, far lower than the surrounding countries, including Russia. Russia's number stands at a reported 14%, so almost 3 times the Ukrainian levels. Plus, when the Azov Battalion ran in Ukraine's 2019 election, representing the far right, they received just 2% of the vote. Instead, Ukraine elected its current president, Volodymyr Zelensky, a Jewish man whose family has been partially wiped out during the Holocaust, the grandson of survivors. And just to emphasize this point further and show another example of the nonsense of Putin's denazification excuse, it was reported in the Times that the Russian president had commissioned the Wagner Group, a collective of mercenaries who've been described as a private paramilitary organization, to assassinate Zelensky. The head of this group is a man called Dmitry Utkin, and he is reportedly a neo-Nazi. There are photographs circulating of Utkin showing Nazi SS tattoos on his shoulder, a Nazi-style eagle or Reichsadler on his chest, and this is the man that Putin has put in charge of assassinating a Jewish man in order to denazify another country. All this being said, you get a lot of unpleasant rhetoric in wartime, and Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Museum, has condemned Putin for the Nazification rhetoric, but also calls out the Ukrainian leadership for comparing Putin to Hitler. Because again, there's this frame of reference for the Ukrainians as much for the Russians of the legacy of fighting against Nazis and the impact the Nazis had.
Wow, that's really interesting. And just leaving aside the rhetoric and the neo-Nazis involved in the fighting, what's been the reaction of the global far right to this war?
So, almost predictably, there are three strands. The far right are fairly disunited, fairly divided, and this is no exception. The first approach has been to say that there is just regret that two white nations, quote unquote, are engaged in what is described as a brothers' war, and their sympathy for the Ukrainian civilians, who are seen as white victims of a terrible war affecting two white nations. The second approach has been one of support for Ukraine. Some in the far right support Ukraine specifically because of the Azov Battalion, using the fact that they are Putin's reported enemy. Putin keeps talking about denazification as proof that he must be a globalist puppet. And this fits into a wider idea of great replacement. And thirdly, there's the pro-Russian stand, which views Russia as the savior of the white race, the final white Christian country that can be relied upon, while Ukraine has been heading towards self-destruction through its efforts to integrate with Western liberal Europe. We anticipate that the far right may coalesce more, especially around Russia, but we're currently monitoring it. Inevitably, the invasion has led to accusations that the entire process is masterminded by Jews, or the more subtle might say globalists. But whether it's Zelensky and the fact that he is Jewish, and for that matter, several senior Ukrainian politicians, or Putin being supposedly controlled by Jewish oligarchs, the far right all seem to agree on just one thing, that Jews are to blame. For example, the former KKK leader, David Duke, says the war is a conspiracy by Jews to kill non-Jews, and so on and so on. So the far right may disagree on whom to support, but they agree on whom to oppose, and that is the Jews. As you said earlier, the wider rhetoric is objectionable, and the far right reaction is something to monitor. But in the immediate term, we must hope, like everyone, that this unjust war ends without any further bloodshed, and that the hardship that the Ukrainian people are currently going through comes to speedy resolution.